Hello everyone and welcome along to another podcast of Clara in Conversation with me, Claire Ford, and RNIB Connect Radio. On today's podcast I am chatting with Dominic Everett. Dominic has recently retired after a wonderful career working as a teacher of history and modern studies, as a teacher of children and young people with vision impairments, as RNIB Scotland's Education and Family Services Manager, and latterly as the Depute Head Teacher of the Royal Blind School in Edinburgh. Retirement hasn't seen Dominic apply the brakes, however. Instead, he has thrown himself into a number of high-profile pursuits, such as taking on the role of chair of a large food bank and setting up his own bowling club for blind and partially sighted people in his hometown of East Kilbride. All of Dominic's achievements have been played out against a backdrop of increasing sight loss, and he has demonstrated consistently throughout his career that being blind or partially sighted should not stop you from achieving your goals. Hello Dominic, and a very warm welcome to Clara in Conversation.
Hello Claire, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for being on the podcast, and I hope everyone at home enjoys it. Dominic, we often speak in the blind and partially sighted community about our blindness or sight loss journey. Your journey began from birth with hereditary cataracts, and in the ensuing years you have experienced several different eye conditions. Can you share with us your sight loss journey?
Sure, no problem at all. I was born in 1969 and had hereditary cataracts. My father had cataract as a child as well, and unfortunately one of my children has too, so it kind of runs in the family. From an early age, I always seemed to have issues. The lenses were removed from my eyes, but from an early age I seemed to develop glaucoma and high intraocular pressure in the eyes. So throughout my childhood I was always in and out of hospital trying to resolve that particular problem. When I was, and I managed fine, I'd say my vision was very low in my left eye, and I was totally blind in my right eye. So I've always kind of regarded myself as a visually impaired person. However, when I was 15, had just come back from holiday and I developed a hemorrhage in my left eye that I had some useful vision in, and they treated that, and I thought all was well, until one day I was sitting in an English class at school and I began to see basically like a curtain falling down in my left eye, just gradually coming down. So I never really thought too much of it, being a teenager, and I went out to the local shops with my friends at the weekend, and I began to walk into things as I was walking along the street, and I thought, oh no, this isn't right, I really need to see what this situation is. So my mum took me into Gartnavel Hospital, and they quickly determined that I had developed a detached retina. So for the next, well, they took me in, they did an eye operation to attach the retina. That didn't work, and then a few weeks later they tried again and that didn't work. Mm-hmm. So I was invited in by my eye surgeon, and he then took me into a kind of theatre in Glasgow where there was a panel of doctors who then looked at my eye on a big screen, and I was told to wait outside. And he came out and said, look, we're going to send you down to Moorfields Eye Hospital in London, where they're going to do a procedure called a vitrectomy, where they insert a silicone bubble into the eye. Previously they'd attempted this with a gaseous bubble. So that was fine. We went down to London, spent time in hospital there, and a couple of months later that didn't work. So the retina began to detach again. So they brought me into hospital, tried it for the fourth time to reattach the retina, and that time it was successful. That then meant that for the next year I had to basically lie with my face in a ring cushion when I went to my bed at night time. I had to walk around kind of doubled over so that pressure would push, or gravity would push this silicone bubble up into onto the retina and hold it in place. So I walked about like an old man really for about a year to try and make sure that the eye remained stable, and then eventually they removed that silicone bubble. So as I say, I missed a whole year of school. So that was my journey up until that point. I then went to the visual impairment unit at Uddingston Grammar, which I think we'll maybe talk about later, to kind of reintroduce myself to education, because I'd missed a whole year of learning, and I went there as a pupil. They had a visual impairment resource centre based within a mainstream school, so that was great. Did my Highers, which is equivalent of A-levels in England, and then went on to university. The next stage of my downturn in my vision really was when I graduated from university in 1991. Went on holiday, and what happened was, unfortunately, I was getting kidney stones from medication I was on, and the doctor suggested that I come off the medication that was dealing with the glaucoma and come back and see him the following week. I went on holiday up into the Highlands of Scotland, beautiful holiday. But as I was there, I was getting massive pain in my eye. So I come back, quickly attended the eye department at Glasgow, and they said, actually, you've lost all the vision up at the top. So the retina remained intact, but all the nerve cells at the upper end of my left eye had gone, and I would never get them back. So that was a massive blow, just as when I was thinking about leaving university, etc. My latest problem, unfortunately, is that I've now developed a corneal edema. So as much as I've got tunnel vision in my left eye, no vision, my eye's been removed, my right eye now, but my left eye, I've now developed a corneal edema, and that's a huge fog, which is really hard to deal with.
I lost most of my sight at the age of 18 due to bilateral optic nerve atrophy, and adjusting to my new life as someone with sight loss was tough. I've had many discussions with members of the blind and partially sighted community about whether they think psychologically it's harder to be born blind or partially sighted and not know any different, or to have sight and lose it later on in life. There is no good time to lose your sight, Dominic, but do you think the various episodes of sight loss that you've encountered in your life made it easier for you to adjust to, or do you think emotionally the cumulative effects of these episodes made it more difficult?
That's a really challenging question. I think it all depends on you as an individual to a certain extent. If I can retrace the steps of my own sight loss journey, I was very fortunate that I had a relatively normal childhood, because I always had quite good vision in one eye, so I could do lots of things that children normally do, running around, kicking a ball, climbing trees, all these things. At each stage of deterioration, that led to a significant period of adjustment, emotionally and practically, and that in itself can be really traumatic almost, because it's losing your sight as a bereavement. So at each dip in my vision, I've had to manage that bereavement, that loss at each point. I think if you're born blind, and having worked with blind children over the years, that's the norm. You've maybe not had sight, and you've adapted your life accordingly. So throughout your life, when you're losing sight, that's really, really hard to manage. The practicalities, the day-to-day living, the ability to read and then perhaps not read, the ability to watch the television and then all of a sudden you can't at different stages, etc. So there's no easy answer to that. It is always hard to lose your sight, whether that be gradually or suddenly. Emotionally, at 16, being a teenager is hard enough. Never mind to all of a sudden lose your sight and be told that's you're going to be blind for the rest of your life, as it was presented to me at the time. And I also would say that it's hard for those around you too when you're losing your sight at different stages. So at any time I've had a dip in my vision, I've maybe taken a few days and felt sorry for myself and get a wee bit frustrated and angry as you do, and then I have to think about those around me as well, because they're also having to adjust to that change, and it's just managing the practicalities of all of that. As I say, that your mental health is definitely affected, there's no doubt about that, and it's never easy, and every single day I get frustrated and maybe slightly upset and annoyed at myself if I can't do things that I could have done before. The current situation I'm in just now is my vision gradually changes throughout the day constantly as well. So 1 minute I may be able to see to do something, and then half an hour later I can't. That in itself can be hard to adjust all the time. And I think that is the issue. You're always having to adjust. As a visually impaired person, you have to think through everything all the time, which can be mentally exhausting, that you have to think about every single thing, whether that be making a cup of tea, or whether that's moving across the room, or if somebody comes and speaks to you and you don't know who that is unless they introduce themselves properly. All of these things are really, really hard, but having to manage that throughout the day when your vision fluctuates is tricky too. And it's a shared journey, a sight loss journey that we talk about. We're very fortunate that we've got visual memory, so when we come to a set of traffic lights, well, we know what a set of traffic lights looks like, or we've remembered. Whereas if you're born blind, all of these things have to be learned from the outset, So yeah, it swings and roundabouts to a certain extent. In some ways we're very fortunate. A lot of the people I talk to just now who are visually impaired, a lot of them get very frustrated that they can't drive anymore. And I'm sure some of your listeners will feel the same. They maybe had these experiences that have been taken away from them, and they find that particularly frustrating. I've never been able to drive, and I'd love to have been able to drive, but it's something that's not been ripped away from me, you know. So again, it's all down to your personal situation.
And prolonged periods of time spent in hospital, Dominic, meant that you missed most of your 5th year in secondary school, and your school were reluctant to allow you to come back to prepare and sit your hires. Do you feel your negative experiences at school fueled your desire to go on and become an educator, to right the obvious wrongs of the education system for blind and partially sighted people?
If I'm perfectly honest, probably not. I don't know if that's the answer you're expecting. To me, the reason why I became a teacher was because I loved history. Having gone to university, studied history, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I thought I want to impart the knowledge that I've gained to others. However, as life has moved on, and I then moved into working within the field of visual impairment, I then began to recognise and perhaps appreciate myself as a visually impaired person, and understand the challenges and the frustrations that a lot of the young people I encountered felt. So I then felt that, or appreciated that I had a responsibility to fight the good fight, let's say, and to make things better for the young people that I was working with. That wasn't the reason why I came into teaching, but certainly was something that I developed the longer I worked within the field of visual impairment, and felt that I had to make improvements and make life better for the young people that I had a duty of care for.
That's really interesting. And over 3 decades after your mum went into battle with the local authority to try and secure your place in school, I had a similar situation. I lost most of my sight just as I was about to sit my hires. My school, St Columba's High School in Gourock, were tremendously empathetic and supportive of me, providing me with a visio book and one-to-one practical and emotional support. Now, Dominic, I think it's safe to say that your acceptance into Uddingston Grammar School transformed your life. It was a school that boasted an innovative VI resource centre, as you mentioned earlier on, which was something that was pretty well unheard of in the mid-1980s. Based on your own personal experiences, would you favour specialised and tailored education, or do you think there are benefits to blind and partially sighted children and young people going into mainstream education?
That's a huge discussion, isn't it? There's no doubt that at that very vulnerable time in my life, when effectively I was an emotional and physical wreck at 16, you know, I was a very, very fragile. And knowing that my mainstream school at that time couldn't support me, okay, they did not have the resources or the skills to help me at that time. Times have moved on from that. However, when I went to Uddingston, it was transformational. I was a working class boy who didn't really value or recognise education as it should. I didn't think university was a place for me. None of my family had ever attended university. I thought university was for posh people. So when I went to Uddingston, they helped me understand that I had a natural intelligence, that I had ability, and that I should indeed think about going to university, right? Which, as I say, I'd never considered before. So in that sense, they helped me manage my vision, they helped me achieve academically and get the qualifications that I needed, and they gave me the confidence and the resilience to go on and aspire to university education. When I went to university, I studied history, as I mentioned, and I thought that would be an ideal occupation for me as a visually impaired person to go and hopefully, you know, hold down a job, let's say, because I was worried about what jobs I could do. When I became a teacher and a teacher of visual impairment, I looked around, and over the 20 years I taught in Uddingston in the visual impairment unit, I had the opportunity to examine what should or shouldn't be regarded as good quality education for visually impaired people. Then, as working for the RNIB, I had an overview of provision in Scotland and could get a feel for what made good provision and what needed to be improved. It's down to the individual child. That's what my views are. I think that for parents, they want their child to attend a local school if possible. It's much more convenient. And they hope that when a child attends a local school, that their visual needs will be met. And ultimately, I think that's what should happen. If you've only got a visual impairment, ideally you should attend your local primary or secondary school, and the visual impairment support services should come in and ensure that you can access the curriculum effectively. Where it gets more challenging is if a child has additional needs, additional learning needs, additional support needs, as we refer to them in Scotland, that those needs are often more of an issue. So the visual impairment can be supported, but if a child's got a learning disability or got more complex care or health needs, that's where things can be a bit more challenging. And I think, personally, having experience working in the Royal Blind School and the work that happens there will always be a need for more complex provision. And I'm not convinced that local authorities do the best possible service for a child who has additional support needs as well as a visual impairment. I think there needs to be a spectrum of provision, and I think the money should follow the child. At the moment, that's not what happens. Often local authorities will say, well, we will not educate a child out of authority because it'll cost us too much money. And I think we have to get round that. And what I'd ideally like to see is a New Zealand model, where in New Zealand they have a national centre of education for children with visual impairment, and when they are determining what support should be provided, it's tailored to the child. So if a child can go to local school, that's where they should go. If a child needs to go to a special school and receive visual impairment support into that special school within a local authority area, that's what should happen. If it is decided that a child needs much more intensive support for whatever reason, then there should be a national provision that ensures that child's needs are being met as well.
You said as late as 2015 that you felt that blind and partially sighted children and young people were surviving, not thriving in education. There definitely needs to be improvement. And you spoke there about how emotionally fragile you were after the various stages of sight loss that you encountered. As an educator yourself, do you feel that there's enough been done to treat and recognise mental health issues in blind and partially sighted children and young people?
I think there's been a growing recognition, certainly within Scottish education, that we're not meeting the mental health needs of a lot of vulnerable children. And that's not just within the field of visual impairment. And at the moment, I think there has to be much more investment in local schools, and CAMS services, so that's children adolescent mental health services. I think more needs to be done to ensure that children, where they have perhaps a new sight loss, have counselling support. And I would widen that and say that families should be provided with that level of support as well, because if we get the families right, we get the children right. And I think a lot of parents that I've encountered, put my RNIB hat on, a lot of families really needed somebody to work with them to make sure that they were doing things right, and that a child's fragile mental health was being supported more effectively as well.
In overcoming obstacle after obstacle, Dominic, you were accepted into Glasgow University to study for your honours degree in history. And whilst you were there, you were met with a setback, as you mentioned, when the medication that you were on was altered by doctors, resulting in further significant sight loss. And on top of everything else that you were going through at the time, that must have been particularly challenging for you to come to terms with. Do you feel any bitterness or resentment about that period of your life, Dominic?
No, I don't actually. So again, your life goes through stages, doesn't it? You know, as an adolescent at 16, you know, that was traumatic. I managed to overcome that battle and went on to university and was successful there. It was just as I was leaving. I'd just graduated in July. I went on holiday in July, and that's when that vision took a massive dip. And that was a time where it was a positive came from it, in a sense. In terms of the bitterness that the doctor who made that decision, and it was a mistake, was the same doctor who fought tooth and nail to get the treatment at Moorfields Eye Hospital for me. So how could I possibly feel bitter towards that guy? He thought he was doing the right thing for me. The medication was causing kidney stones and causing a lot of pain. He thought by taking me off that medication for a week and come back in a week, he thought that would be okay, and then we would evaluate that situation. Unfortunately, I lost a massive amount of my vision at the top. I can't feel bitter towards that man. He did what he thought was in the best interests of my vision, and unfortunately it didn't work. A positive that came from it was that my wife and I decided to, at that point, to get married. Because my wife decided, actually, do you know what she proposed to me? She said, I think we need to think about our life. If you're going to lose your sight completely, let's get married quickly and let's have a family as soon as we can as well. So if I had any vision left, then I could perhaps see the children growing up. And now, in reflection, 30 years we've been married this year, that was a great decision. That was a really positive thing that came out of that particular tragic situation at that time. And it's been really, really good.
And in 1991, Dominic, you applied for teacher training and were faced with yet another setback when the requirements of the General Teaching Council were that all applicants must have full vision in one eye. Can you tell us how you managed to navigate that obstacle?
So that was a funny one, because I knew I wanted to be going to teaching. I knew I wanted to teach history. At that time, it's changed now. The General Teaching Council for Scotland did demand that you had full vision in one eye, because to their mind you had to be able to manage the classroom and ensure that children could leave the school safely if there's a fire, etc. So I applied. I got this letter back to say these were the requirements. However, what they would do is they would send me for a medical, which I did. I went to see a doctor in Glasgow, and the doctor was great. The doctor said, well, look, I'm going to recommend that you still be allowed to proceed and attend teacher training college, as it was referred to then. And obviously I spoke to the principal of the college as a consequence of that, and he said, okay, we do have reservations because of the level of vision you have, but let's try it. And I qualified with distinction through that year. I proved myself out in teacher practice. I met all the academic requirements of the course, and as I say, I gained a distinction in my teaching practice. What I had to do was think very carefully about how I managed the classroom. So I was perhaps more mobile than a lot of teachers. As a history teacher, you could theoretically do chalk and talk and stand at the front of the class and from a sedentary position and teach and lecture. That wasn't my style. And I was able to maintain good discipline in the class with good humour, and I moved around the class when the children were working. And the odd comment from children, because I wear very thick reading glasses, and I have to go in quite close when I'm looking at children's work. Now, my vision was better then, remember, right? A lot better then than it is now. But I would, lean in and go in close to see the children's work. Or sometimes I'd be a wee bit sneaky and say to the child, read that back to me, will you? And the child would read what they're written, and then I kind of get around things that way as well. Yeah. So I was very lucky. I never had any issues with discipline. I had a really good teaching career as a history teacher, and I like to think that I had a good relationship with the kids, and we got on really well, and I believe I was an effective practitioner.
And you've been a teacher of history and modern studies and of children and young people with vision impairments for over 2 decades, Dominic, coming full circle and returning to your alma mater of Uddingston Grammar School. Can you tell us what it was like to be at the other end of the lectern and teaching at your old school?
That was actually okay. When I started teaching, I was very young. I was 21 and a half. So that was odd. Really, I'd only been away from school for about 4 or 5 years. So a lot of the teachers were still there who taught me, at school. And here was me working alongside them, either in the history department or eventually within the visual impairment unit itself. Was I treated differently? Probably, they all knew me as a visual impaired person, so that was good, that they were very supportive. My colleagues, they understood I had a visual impairment, and they helped me, if I needed it, I could reach out for a bit of support if required. Working alongside the visual impairment teachers when I moved into the visual impairment unit, that was unusual because they perhaps saw me as somebody who required help more than even the history department did. But I had to kind of prove myself, that I was able to do the job effectively, and maybe I was treated as the boy for a wee while. But I think age overcomes a lot of that, because the longer you're in position, the longer you're doing a job, you then start to become part of the paintwork, the brickwork, and as people come in behind you, they look to you for knowledge, they look to you for support and advice, and you become the person, the go-to person. So over the years, as I say, I was teaching in Uddingston in the history department, then as a visual impairment teacher for 20 years. So I was very much part of the old guard by the time I left in 2011. And I like to think I made a serious contribution to the lives of many children who had a visual impairment, and I like to think a positive impact.
That's fantastic. And In 2011, Dominic, you switched career path to become the Education and Family Services Manager for RNIB Scotland, and it was in this post that I first met you. You suggested that I join HAGI, the Youth Forum for Blind and Partially Sighted Children and Young People living in Scotland. Do you think it's important for blind and partially sighted people to come together to share their ideas and experiences?
Most definitely. And I think that's the beauty of, if I look at the provision of education, certainly in Scotland, where you've got mainstream schools or you've got resource centres in mainstream for visually impaired pupils, and obviously specialist environments like the Royal Blind School, right across that spectrum, it's really important that children and young people and adults have an opportunity to mix within the visually impaired community and be very integral to the sighted community as well. So the ethos within Uddingston when I taught there was that yes, we had a VI unit, or Visual Impairment Resource Centre as properly called. So the children had the resources and the support and given the strategies to manage their learning and live with their sight loss condition, but they were also part of a mainstream school, and that was very, very important. For as an adult and for adults, it's really important as well that we are able to engage with our visually impaired peers, get support, emotional and practical support from one another, but also it's really important that we are fully engaged within a wider community and are ambassadors for blindness or sight loss. It's really important that sighted people recognise us and that we're not hidden away in our houses somewhere, that we're out there, we're involved in clubs and groups and making things happen within society. Because the more that's normalised, then the more it's accepted and our voice is equally heard as well. Now, you mentioned HAGI. HAGI's brilliant for that, because what HAGI is a youth forum here within Scotland, it's providing confidence and resilience for young people with a visual impairment. They're meeting their friends who are similar. And that's one of the downsides of mainstream provision, actually. Sometimes a child who might just go to the local school might be the only visually impaired pupil in that school. And that's positive in a way, but they're also not getting an opportunity to meet other people like them. So by creating opportunities like HAGI, is giving them an opportunity to go and meet other young people and learn from one another, and also to strengthen the voice of visually impaired young people and the wider visually impaired community across Scotland as well, and to bang the drum and make things happen and be involved. You know, RNIB used to be called the Royal National Institute for the Blind. It's of the blind now, and it's really important that we are helping to shape policy, helping to shape practice across Scotland and the wider UK as well.
I've really benefited from hearing other people's stories and representing other people's views. Through HAGI that I've joined the Scotland Committee, now the advisory group at RNIB, and now volunteering as well. So, you know, it's been great for me in many, many ways, and it's I think it definitely has brought out my confidence, and I'm sure a lot of HAGI members that are listening, previous HAGI members, will feel the same way as well.
That's very interesting, and to be honest, I celebrate my sight loss now. I have accepted my sight loss condition. I think that it has massively enriched my life. I have met wonderful people as a visually impaired person, and I might not have met those people if I didn't have a visual impairment. So in many ways, it's made a huge positive impact on my life. You know, whether it be working within education and meeting lots of wonderful young people, whether it be at RNIB, where I get a chance to travel across the UK, travel across the world. One of the nicest experiences I had at RNIB was that I took a group of young people up to Orkney, the Orkney Islands, and we went around youth clubs doing visual impairment awareness training. Now, that was brilliant, right? Because one, it was great to see these young people leading, awareness, but also it was wonderful to see the impact that they had on the wider sighted community, who really learned so much. And I'd love to see more of that happening, that more visual impairment awareness is delivered, whether it be by HAGI or whoever, just to normalise the whole situation and make a huge difference to people's lives.
It's fantastic. And the work that HAGI do, there's obviously been massive changes because of COVID and because of Brexit, but they're still there and they're still trying to do the best, and the same with the RNIB as a whole.
Well, I'm going to be a wee bit controversial here, Claire. I hope you don't mind me saying. When I was at RNIB with Haggai, we went away over to the European Parliament, and it allowed young Scottish teenagers to engage with people with a visual impairment right across the European community, and I thought that was amazing, that this whole notion of inclusion and pushing forward an inclusion agenda was great. I think it's a shame that now can't happen because of Brexit.
Yeah.
So
Really
that's
sad.
just my political opinion on that one. It's a real shame.
We've just got to adapt. And after 5 years of being the Education and Family Services Manager at RNIB Scotland, you returned to school again, but only this time becoming the Depute Head Teacher of the Royal Blind School in Edinburgh. And to put that into historical context, the Royal Blind School was founded in 1793 at the height of the French Revolution. It must have been a huge honour and a huge responsibility, Dominic, to be in such a prominent position of a school that has served the VI community for over 2 centuries.
I'm really pleased you brought in some historical knowledge there. That's great. One of my favourite topics is the French Revolution. The Royal Blind School is an amazing organisation. Has served Scotland for 200 odd years, 250 odd years. Has an important place within the visual impairment community here within Scotland. They face a lot of challenge at the moment. One of that being, I mentioned earlier on, that local authorities often decide that they'll do everything they can to keep a child within the local authority, even though it might not necessarily be in that child's best interests, purely because they can't afford to send a child to the Royal Blind School. So Royal Blind School is a grant-aided school. That means they get money from the Scottish Government, they get money from local authorities to keep the doors open. So yes, I was very proud to be part of that. One of the things that I'm particularly proud of is that Royal Blind School had to adapt. So what I helped to set up was a peripatetic outreach service from the Royal Blind School. So they began to deliver services to children within their local school in East Lothian. And I now believe since I've left, they've expanded that and they're delivering services in Orkney, in Mid Lothian and West Lothian as well. So a combination of a specialist school environment for very complex needs young people, but also providing and sharing the knowledge of the Royal Blind School into the wider mainstream school community as well. So I was really pleased that I could help establish that. That's
fantastic. And the most recent statistics by RNIB state that there are approximately 84,500 blind and partially sighted people living in the UK of working age. Only 1 in 4 of the blind and partially sighted community are currently in employment, and this has been a state of play for decades. As someone who's had a successful career, Dominic, what do you think needs to be done to improve these statistics?
Okay, that's huge as well. So, 2 issues. Employers have a responsibility to ensure that visually impaired people have access to the workplace. Whether that's through them being better prepared and more knowledgeable about visual impairment. I think they may be very nervous, especially for a small company, about taking somebody on who is visually impaired. If you don't really know, even through the best will of the world, they may want to provide employment, but they don't know what to do and how to make that happen. I think there are issues with access to work. A lot of people don't know about access to work support. And if they do and manage to get support from access to work, quite often I've heard that the equipment's not available from day one, so it might take 2 or 3 weeks or a month for your equipment to arrive. And the danger there is that the visually impaired person just appears as a burden to the office environment or the working environment that they've managed to get a job in. So that's not good, and it makes it really awkward for people to when they get into employment for the first time. It's awkward. I think a lot of people don't know that access to work can provide transport support, access through taxis and things like that as well. And I think often that's kept in the QT so that people don't apply for too much money from access to work as well. I also think there's a responsibility on us as visually impaired people to be more prepared for employment. So there's a combination. I think young people at school need to be given not just the academic support that they need to manage their visual impairment, but they need to be given the social skills and the practical skills that will make them attractive to an employer, right? And I don't think enough of that happens And that maybe comes back to what you referred to earlier on, that a lot of our children are taught to survive and not really thrive. So they might leave school with lots of hires and A-levels in their pocket, but they're not attractive to an employer, right? So I think more needs to be done in terms of communication skills, social skills, and working on all the nuances of helping them to fit into the workplace. I think that's really important. So the employer needs to help people fit into the workplace, and visually impaired people need to do more so that they can work within a working environment. I also think one of the things that is not being provided with enough is work experience. A lot of young visually impaired people don't know about all the jobs that are out there. The jobs that they know of are maybe the professionals that have wrapped around them and helped them over the years. So they might say, I want to be a teacher, I want to be a social worker, I want to be a psychologist, because those are the kind of people that they've come into contact over the years. But they don't know about the vast array of jobs that are available out there. And I think what we need to do is make sure that young people get work experience in their 4th, 5th and 6th year at school. Most mainstream sighted young people get a week's work experience. I think visually impaired children and young people need to have more work experience than that, to help them understand what the world of work actually looks like, and to give them that positive ethos that I can go out and I can compete in the workplace and I can hold down a job and be much more independent in adult life.
I've heard a lot of stories about access to work. I heard a couple of stories in particular about things not being in place and it affects people going out to work. So it's
but also volunteering. Volunteering is a great route into employment for visually impaired people, and I think access to work have got a duty to help people with a visual impairment who want to go and volunteer, to make sure they've got the resources, because if you can get that right, then that then gives them the evidence to go to an employer and say, look, I've been volunteering with this agency for such and such a period of time, these are the resources that I use to do that successfully. If you give me a job, this is what I can do too. So you've got something positive to take into the interview and things too.
And on the subject of RNIB, back onto the subject of that, whilst you were at RNIB Scotland, you successfully secured funding for the Iris project. Can you tell us a bit about that?
That is one of my proudest moments in employment, I have to say. At RNIB, as I said, I was the Education and Family Services Manager, so I would support children within school to ensure that they got the support that they needed and provided for by local authorities. I provided services for young people by running family weekends, residential camps, etc. All of that work was to ensure that the young people understood their vision and were able to share that with others, so that others understood their visual loss, and also that they had the resources and the practical skills to be successful in their lives. Also provide support to families. However, the longer I was in the post, I thought actually more needs to be done at the very earliest stage of intervention. So as soon as a child or young person like you and I at 16 or 18, as soon as we were diagnosed as having a visual impairment, my notion was that we had to have a wraparound service where people literally put their arm around that family, not just the young person, the family, to say, do you know what, we're here to help and we will share your journey. And that was the notion of Iris. It was early intervention. So, and it was for a period of time. We deliberately engineered it that it would last about 12 weeks. So a bit like the RNIB ECLOs, the eye clinic liaison officers, we would pick up that child, we would do home visits, so it wasn't hospital based. We would go and visit the family in the home, ensure that the family knew how to make their home safe for a child, for example, or knew about different agencies and organisations that could provide financial and practical support, and then we would back off eventually and make sure that all the agencies were set up. And the whole notion was to prevent crisis, because what we thought was families were coming to me when they were in crisis as the manager. I wanted to prevent that crisis from the very beginning of the journey and try and reduce the strain and stress on the whole family unit. And I like to think that we made a massive difference. So we got about £500,000 from the big lottery fund, and I employed two Iris officers, and they basically worked in Glasgow and the west of Scotland, and they provided, I think, major support for families.
That's amazing. And I think it's safe to say from all you've said so far, you have made a massive impact in the lives of children and young people with vision impairments and their families. And in 2019, you decided to retire. Not to sit at home in your pipe and slippers though.
Don't smoke.
You became the chair of a very large and busy food bank. Can you tell us a bit about the work of the Loaves and Fishes Food Bank, Dominic?
Sure. I didn't want to just sit at home. I wanted to be busy. Now, unfortunately, I retired in March 2020, so it was really when the COVID pandemic broke out. So that was difficult for everyone. But at that time also, I began to realise that there were lots of people who are really struggling financially because of furlough and all these things. So I reached out to a local food bank here in East Kilbride called Loaves and Fishes, who've been on the go for 30 years, delivering soup kitchens for people in real need in Glasgow, but of late began to set up a food bank. So I get involved, and not knowing anything about food banks, I literally said, look, I phoned them up and I said, look, I'm blind, I'm not sure what I can do, but I'd like to do something. So the manager at the time said, well, come in, right, and let's see what we can do. So literally, I made up tea bags. I'd open up a box of tea bags and I'd take out 60 and I put them in a smaller bag. I moved on to washing powder, etc, etc. I couldn't go around and identify foods to make up a food parcel. I can't see the difference between a tin of soup and a tin of beans, right? It's too challenging for me to do that in a busy, rushed environment. But I knew that I could do something, and these smaller jobs are just as important in a larger scale organisation. But slowly but surely, I get more involved. And I started to go out with the guy who was the chairman at the time. Him and I would go out in the van, and we would pick up food donations, or we would drop off food to those who were very vulnerable and couldn't get out of their house, including those who were, because of COVID, had to isolate, etc. Now, what I would do, with a tiny bit of vision I've got, Dennis would walk in front of me with his fluorescent jacket. I could see that, and I was good at carrying things, and I still felt as though I'm making a huge contribution. But being in the van, being in the office, they began to realise I've got perhaps a bit more ability than that. So gradually I get more and more involved in the day-to-day running of the food bank. So I'm now the chairman, and I will be for a few years. And sadly, at the moment, last week we helped feed 150 households last week. So that's people who have, financial issues. It may well look at drug or alcohol dependency. It may well be that they are working but just not earning enough money to make ends meet. We've got fuel crisis at the moment. Food prices are shooting through the roof, etc. So there are many families, and increasing numbers of families, coming to us just now and saying, can you help feed our children? And that's what we're doing.
Yeah. It's sad to say that here in the UK in 2022, in the world's 5th biggest economy, we have to rely heavily on food banks. How do we as a society, Dominic, address the underlying problems that lead people to seek recourse to food banks?
So at the moment, we have more food banks in the UK than we do have McDonald's restaurants. Here in East Kilbride, we have 3 food banks. There's over 100 here in Scotland. So there is a growing need for food aid. People, for whatever reason, you don't go to a food bank unless you really need it. So people come to us who are desperate, and it's non-judgmental. So regardless of why I didn't help, we will make sure we do that. What we need in society is a caring government. We need a government that recognises food poverty, that recognises that we have a low income society. And I think a solution is that we ensure that people have what is called a universal basic income. So instead of people having to come to me looking for food, that they've got enough money in their pocket that they can actually genuinely just go away and buy foodstuffs. So we need to do something at a governmental level.
And in 2021, Dominic, you also founded your own bowling club in East Kilbride, the first of its kind in South Lanarkshire, and one that was even praised in the Scottish Parliament. Can you tell us what made you decide to set up your own bowling club, and how do blind and partially sighted bowlers play the game?
So I have played bowls since I was 14. I'm now 52, right? But I've played bowls since I was 14. And at each stage of my sight loss, I gave up. So, when I lost my sight at 16, I stopped playing bowls for about 4 years. Then I went back and I started to use a telescope to try and see to the other end of the green. And then when I was, say, 21, I had that other dip. I gave up again, and I thought I definitely can't play anymore. I then went back and tried again. And each time I've been frustrated that I'm not able to compete against the sighted bowlers as well as I could previously. So what happened was about 3 years ago, when I stopped work, I thought, right, okay, I enjoy bowls. Why should I stop playing bowls? Every time I have a wee crisis in my life, emotional breakdown, why do I always stop? And I think it's because I recognise I can't see to the other end of the green. I can't see the jack. I now can't see the balls at my feet. So at each stage of that, we've talked about earlier on about that period of adjustment. I go through a period and I go, do you know what? I can't do this anymore. Why am I doing this? This is really frustrating. And then I work my way through that and I think, actually, why stop? So there are visually impaired bowlers in Scotland. It's called VIBS, Visual Impairment Bowl Scotland. So I reached out to them when I stopped working and I said, look, I've stopped playing bowls, but I'd like to play. And they said, well, there's a club in Paisley. Why don't you go along there and see how you get on? So I did. I joined that club, but I wanted to create something within East Kilbride. East Kilbride's a large town with 70,000 people. I thought there must be enough visually impaired people here within the town, like me, who'd like to play bowls. So that's what we did. We had a come and try session. We had 12 people came to try for the day, and we now have a club with 11. We're now the biggest visually impaired bowling club within Scotland, and we're competing against other clubs on a regular basis. How you play it is quite different. Normally in bowls you throw, like a jack goes up to the other end of the green, and it's a bit like curling, etc., where you just try and get your bowl as near to the jack as possible. What you do in the visually impaired bowls is you have a sighted director, somebody who can see at the other end of the green. You play your bowl and they describe where your bowl is lying using a clock face. So your bowl can be at 12 o'clock or 6 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock, and then you work out the direction or the distance away from the jack from that. So it's great. I absolutely love it, and I'm just about to go and play and represent Scotland in an international tournament in Israel in March, which is, again, a positive thing that's come from being a visually impaired person.
Absolutely, and all the best for that in the coming weeks. One of our big passions, Dominic, that both you and I share is public speaking, which most people find absolutely terrifying, and I don't blame them. I belong to the Greenock Ladies Speakers Club, and just after we first met back in August of 2014, after I lost my sight, I became a member of Haggai, and subsequently for 4 years I represented Haggai at the Scottish Youth Parliament as an MSYP. How easy is it, do you think, for blind and partially sighted people, many of whom don't use Braille, to fully participate in public speaking? And what do you yourself, Dominic, gain from the experience?
Mm-hmm. As much as I do enjoy speaking, and I suppose I'm a fairly confident speaker, it doesn't make it less nerve-wracking, right, over the years. And I think because of my vision, that in itself, the practicalities of delivering a speech have always been hard. So, you know, as the journey, you know, I was partially sighted, I could read large print. I then moved on to using like a tablet, and I could zoom in and when I was talking, etc. Or I'd use PowerPoint, but I'd have to stand right up against the screen to see and things like that as well. So I couldn't see the laptop, but I could see the massive enlargement behind me. But again, all of that has gone at each stage of my sight loss. So now I know Braille, but I'm not a Brailleist. I don't use Braille. When I deliver a speech, I have to say I tend to just do it from memory. I tend to deliver, and I have been complimented on the fact that I'm a natural speaker. So I know what I have to say, and I just say it as it is, rather than try to be robotic and stick to very strict notes. I try to memorise key bullet points, and then I talk to those bullet points in my head. And I've tried several ways, different options, but that's what seems to work for me. And I can just be myself, be a plain speaker, and hopefully that continues to be effective.
Well, I'm exactly the same. I've tried so many ways as well, because it was like a marathon. It's like a marathon for the eyes, reading large print, because you're having to read, and especially with me with a peripheral vision, the sight that I have, the remaining sight that I have is peripheral vision. it's eccentric reading, so you're having to read at the corner of your eyes, and that is
It's
very
exhausting.
terrifying.
It's physically exhausting, absolutely. And again, going back to our earlier conversation, actually sometimes if you're born blind and you become a brailleist and you're a very fast reader at braille, that can actually appear much more effective than somebody who's having to hold something up very close to their face, which in itself becomes a barrier, a physical barrier for people to see your face, and also affects the way that you speak. And then, you know, so in terms of somebody hearing what you have to say, that in itself is a challenge, you know. So I have worked alongside many very competent, totally blind braillists who are brilliant public speakers because they're able to read their notes and do that way. I've worked with other people who maybe wear an earpiece, and you know, they've got something, a device in front of them, a tablet, and they're listening, and they can then repeat more or less what they've already written in their notes. That's never worked for me. I tend to just speak from the heart and from memory.
And one of your big passions in life, out with volunteering and all your commitments, is tandem cycling. Is this something that you do as part of a club, or do you have to force your wife Joanne to don a cycling helmet and venture out with you?
Joanne has blatantly refused to go on the tandem bike with me. We did it once as teenagers. I've been with my wife since we were 17, 18. She's always known me as a visually impaired person. So we went to Millport, which is an island off of Scotland where lots of people cycle round on the Isle of Cumbrae. And we wrapped ourselves around a lamppost within seconds when Joanne was the pilot on the tandem. So since that day, she refused she'll ever go on a tandem bike with me. No, I'm a member of the Glasgow Tandem Club, which I'm new. It's a newly formed club, and they go on regular runs. But I tend to go out, just because of other commitments, I don't get out as much as I would like, but I tend to go out with my daughter's partner. He's my pilot. It's very important that you get somebody of round about the equal weight as you. So I couldn't have somebody who's thinner than me or lighter than me at the front. So without getting into too much detail, I need somebody who's fairly hefty to be on the front so that they can hold the weight of the bike and hold me on as well.
And another thing that you enjoy, which I share as well, is our love of football. Although we won't mention where our allegiances lie. I attend domestic and international matches with the ex-blind parties who have been providing audio commentaries for blind and partially sighted football fans at games in Scotland since 1937. And you yourself, Dominic, were a member of the ex-blind parties for many years at your club. How important do you think the work of the ex-blind parties is, Dominic, at most grounds in Scotland in providing blind and partially sighted football fans with an enjoyable matchday experience?
I think it's fabulous, and I think it's so crucial. Football is a huge part of people's lives, whether we like it or not. For many, many people, football or lots of other sports are crucial bridges to social conversation. A lot of blind people really struggle with social conversation because we've got non-verbal communication as an issue for us. Even being and having the opportunity to engage fully within the wider community for many can be a challenge. Football is a conversation starter often, right? In many circles. So you talk about the weather, you talk about politics, you talk about religion, football, etc. These are keystones to conversation and civil discussion around a dinner table or at the pub or whatever. So for me, something like that where you can go and participate, engage, have fun, talk to those around you, come away from it, go to your workplace or go back to your family, and you can talk about the events of the day or what happened at a football match. These are really, really crucial. One of the fond memories I've got when I taught in Uddingston was I had a pupil in the school who was football mad. She adored a particular Glasgow football team, I'll not name which, and she adored them. We're teaching her Braille, and we're finding it difficult finding a reading material that she would read for pleasure. Many Braillists listening to this will know that often Braille becomes quite mechanical, and for many people it becomes a chore unless you develop a love of learning, a love of reading. So we're trying to find a genre that she really loved, and what we discovered was football biographies or autobiographies and fanzines. So we would then buy fanzines, quickly braille those out so that she could take them home and learn about her favourite football player and all these things. Because these were the conversations that were taking place at home around the dinner table, and she wanted to be part of that. So yes, I think the Rex Supporters Club, which has been going on since the 1930s or something, I think, is vital, because it's a real avenue for social inclusion.
I think I've become more a football fan since joining my Rex Blind parties at my club. I was like a casual fan where I just went to the football, I enjoyed it, whereas now I'm more informed and I'm more insightful about it than what I was before. So
absolutely.
It's something that's really changed my life, along with many other things that I do now as a result of my vision impairment. So here to all the work of all the people in the Rex Blind parties and all the people going by who did audio commentaries. Is definitely one of the things that means a lot to me, means a lot to you, and means a lot to the members at any party in Scotland, really.
But also I'd like to add that it's really important for visually impaired people to be seen at football matches. It's all this whole notion of acceptance and being a part of the sighted world. The more we're out and about and engaged and being seen to be out and about, I think it's only positive.
Absolutely. And I definitely think it's just making sure that more and more people of the younger demographic go to the Rex Blind parties, because I just feel that still there's more of an older audience in the actual organisation. Certainly at my club, I feel as if there's more older people than younger people of my age group. And on a previous podcast I was obviously talking about that and how we try and get more younger people into it. And it's just really being out there, just actually raising awareness of it and just trying to just get that word out.
100%, absolutely. Maybe they just don't know about it.
Definitely not. And they probably think because there is so many older people in it, they probably think this is for older people. So people like myself and other people in the blind parties at other clubs as well, it's up to us to really make a difference, and
definitely.
It's definitely something that I would love to pursue. And I have had the privilege of meeting your lovely wife Joanne, Dominic, and Clara and Daniel, two of your three children, at various RNIB Scotland Shape and Share events over the years. And alongside your other daughter Jennifer, they have been tremendously supportive of you. And I believe, from speaking to you before we started the interview, that you've had a new addition to the family over the last couple of years. How valuable do you think that having a good family support network is in a sight loss journey, Dominic?
You had a Freudian slip there. Invaluable. They're invaluable. They really are. So my wife, I mentioned earlier on, my wife has always known me as a visually impaired person, right? So it was never an issue for her, which is wonderful. We started going out, we were 17, 18, something like that. And as I say, we're 30 years married now. Joanne has always been there for me at the times of emotional tenderness, fragility, but also at the same time not giving me too much sympathy, because maybe I've just loved that too much and feel sorry for myself. So sometimes, that process where you go through, where you go, oh no, what am I going to do now? Oh, this is terrible. Okay, you can feel sorry for yourself for a wee while, and then you have to actually give yourself a shake and move on. That's my own thoughts. And I think because I've constantly faced that through my adult life, you've had that period of grief, and then your resilience kicks in and you have to quickly move on and kind of deal with situations. So Joanne's always been there to bolster that and make that happen, and also create a lot of stability here within the family home as well. In terms of my children, they've always had a visually impaired dad, whether it be me with my reading glasses leaning in to clean their dirty nappies, right through to, the challenges of parenting as a visually impaired person. A lot of your audience, I'm quite sure, experience that too. They see me as a long cane user. They see that their dad, uses audio description on the television and, listens to a lot of talking books and all these sort of things. So that's just become day-to-day normality for them as they've grown up. But as a consequence, I think that's fulfilled their life as well. I think they've got a positive understanding of disability. They accept people for who they are, and that disability is not a barrier to life. As they've grown older as well, they've supported me at times, with some of the projects I've been involved in. As you say, some have attended some RNIB events. My only son, he was active when I was taking kids on sailing trips, for example, when I was at RNIB up the west coast of Scotland, and he got involved through Ocean Youth Trust Scotland and things as well, and supporting RNIB. So there's loads of things. My daughter Clara, she came and supported me every year when we ran the summer camps and things as well. So they've always appreciated that visual impairment is a significant part of my life, but they've also recognised that it's only a very small part of who I am as well. So that's really, really important too. So again, going back to what I said earlier on, visual impairment has actually been quite a positive part of my life, but also it's been quite a positive part of my family's life too.
Definitely. It should be just one part of you, because ultimately you're like everybody else, but you've just got this vision impairment or disability or whatever, and it shouldn't define who you are. And I think it's, for me, really, it's what you were saying there about being supportive but not being too sympathetic. And I can say that about my family as well. Certainly my mum and my dad, they're very much sympathetic, compassionate, and then occasionally they'll maybe say to me, look, you know, get a grip, you've been like this for a wee while.
Absolutely.
And that's it.
And you do need a shake, don't you, sometimes?
And that's what it is, It's getting the balance right between, because you've got to carry on in life, you've got to go on with it.
I don't want anybody to feel sorry for me.
Yeah, exactly.
No, aye.
And I know certainly a lot of the mental health charities are getting this message out saying it's okay not to be okay sometimes.
Yeah.
It's getting the balance right, because everybody, even people who don't have vision impairments, have wobbles, they have down periods, they have periods where they need to confide in someone, and I think it's all about just getting the balance, and that's something certainly that I've personally struggled with at times, but you've just got to try and find that balance. I
100% agree. I don't want people to listen to this thinking that, you know, Dominic manages a situation every time he has a sight loss drop, you know, a sight loss. I don't. You know, I do go through that personal trauma every single time. I really, really do. Yeah. And even when I stopped working, you know, I went through a kind of wee blip where I thought, right, I found the day-to-day job becoming increasingly challenging. And I'm a great believer that if you're a visually impaired person and you can't work, then you shouldn't be made to work. Likewise, I think if you're a visually impaired person who can work and is able to work and can do a job that you can do, then you should be able to do that too. With my own career, some people ask me, why did you retire at 50? Because my job became so challenging that it was starting to impact on my mental health. I was finding it really frustrating, really difficult to deal with the day-to-day administration tasks at a high pace. People were coming to my office asking for advice and support, and I was being asked to read things that I couldn't read quickly enough and things like that as well. So I was finding the day-to-day duties of my job becoming increasingly hard. And I mean, alongside that, you know, I was managing a real drop in my vision as well. And I thought, well, do you know what? See if I could just take work out of my life and then manage the sight loss just now. That'll help me. So that was a difficult time. I had to go for counselling support at that point, you know, and I kind of felt guilty that I was walking away a wee bit. I felt as though, am I failing? I've been proselytising, encouraging young people to be successful in their life, and here's me, I'm not coping, you know. But I've had to think about that and reflect on it and think, well, do you know what? No, I wasn't coping at that time, and
there's nothing to be ashamed of.
That's it. Yeah. But I think you still do go through those periods of,
absolutely,
you know,
absolutely.
You're seen as a role model, and I have been a role model for young people my whole life. But all of a sudden I'm saying, well, do you know what? I'm not coping just now, and I needed that period of reflection and time out so that I could reevaluate my life for that period of time. And I've done that now, and I've moved on to a new chapter as well, albeit without the frustrations of having to go to my work every day.
Absolutely. And on behalf of the blind and partially sighted community, I would like to thank you for all the work you've done over the past 30 years, and I hope your retirement is as fulfilling as your career has been. And thank you for being my guest on Clara Bell in Conversation. It's been a pleasure.
And it's been lovely talking to you again. Thank you, Claire.